There are a wide variety of definitions of communication that highlight various perspectives from which they come. And I want to expose you to a few of those definitions, especially I want to juxtapose the definitions that focus on transmission of information versus those that are more dynamic. Here's a definition by Miller in 1951. Definition goes like this: communication means that information is passed from one place to another. And then Hovland, Janis, and Kelly in 1953 define communication this way: the process by which an individual transmits stimuli to modify the behavior of another individual. So we're still looking at transmission even if we're dealing with persuasion in that particular definition. And then we have a definition that starts to encompass a little bit more than this transmissional element. Roche and Bateson in 1961 define communication this way: it's not to just refer to verbal, explicit, and intentional transmission of messages. The concept of communication would include all of those processes by which people influence one another. And then in 1967, Dance defined communication this way: human communication is eliciting a response through verbal symbols. So you see there's a wide variety of definitions that are provided there. And I want to offer up some criteria for a definition that we would use in this class. And that would be that it would meet Miller's 3 elements of communication that are widespread areas of convergence amongst communication scholars. The 3 areas are first process, secondly interaction, and third meaning. Process assumes that communication is continuous. That is, it doesn't stop. And that it also is very dynamic. It's always changing. Secondly, interaction assumes that communication is transactional, that you exchange messages, and it's within social activity. And thirdly, we have meaning or symbol. And this is where you co-create meaning with a symbol system. And we have various symbols that we use. We have language that we use. We have gestures and artifacts that may signify something. Ogden and Richard's triangle of meaning is an excellent way to conceptualize how we create meaning using symbols. And you'll take a look at that in the notes, would you? Now, when we look at Conrad and Poole's 1998 definition of communication, it encompasses these 3 areas of convergence. First, we have process, because it's a process by which people interactively create, sustain, and manage meaning. That's identified very quickly here. Secondly, there's the interaction, because they create, sustain, and manage meaning interactively. And then finally, we have meaning that's represented there, and it's something that's obviously, when you look at create, sustain, and manage, very dynamic in terms of how they do that. Now, as we move on to listening, we want our definition of listening to match the dynamism and to fit with how we look at communication, but we want communication to take a listening-centered approach for a variety of reasons, not just because we're in a listening class, but partly because listeners assume a lot of responsibility within the communication process. Scholars think that actually listeners assume about 80% of effective communication responsibility. That is a lot to place on the shoulders of the listener, which means that the skills of the listener become very important in communication contexts. We'll first look at the International Listening Association's definition for communication. In 1994, they defined communication as the process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken and/or nonverbal messages. And obviously, when we're going to look at communication and then the role of the listener and the process of listening, we're going to include how we receive messages, how they come first in through hearing and seeing, but we're also going to add in written messages, not just spoken messages, because I assume that many of you have already text messaged somebody today or emailed today, because we use technology, and largely when we use technology, we're using it in written form in order to communicate with others. And so as we adopt the Hurrier's model process for understanding listening and what's going on in the listening process, you're going to see that the International Listening Association's definition is a good starting point, but it's maybe not our ending point. The Hurrier model that we look at in this particular course incorporates hearing, understanding, recalling and remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and then finally responding. And it adopts a systems approach because it looks at hearing, understanding, recalling, interpreting, evaluating, and responding, as basically being interrelated microprocesses within a system. A system has different parts that are interrelated. When one part, something happens to it, it affects all the other parts. And so that's the same with the microprocesses of the HURIER model. And what you hear is going to affect how you recall information. How you interpret information is going to affect how you respond to people and so forth. Also, the HURIER model incorporates the relational perspective that we talked about. And the relational perspective really emphasizes things like perceptual filters. And in the HURIER model, we're going to refer to those perceptual filters primarily when we talk about understanding, when we talk about interpreting, but they will be peppered throughout. We're going to talk about our communication framework and how our framework is going to impact how we receive and interpret and understand those messages, and then how we respond back to people. So you're going to find that the relational perspective is going to give us insight on the HURIER model.